Good afternoon, Ms. Bobert. Can we get an audio video check, please?
Just a second, I'm trying to turn my camera on. Sorry about that.
Can hear you. Nine, 7, 6, 5, 4.
We are meeting today to hear testimony on 3 bills. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearing are limited to the chairman and the ranking member or their designees. This allows us to hear from our witnesses sooner and helps members keep their schedule. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they're submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. And hearing no objection, that is so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. As described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Members who are physically present should provide a hard copy for staff to distribute by email. Please note that members are responsible for their own microphones. And those who are joining online, please do remember to mute yourself. You'll be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems, please inform committee staff immediately. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes. And again, good afternoon, everyone. Before we get to the business of the day, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge the profound absence that we feel here in the committee today. This is our first hearing without the former chairman, the dean of the House, the venerable Congressman Don Young. Don and I went around and round on a bunch of different issues. We were sometimes adversaries, at least in our politics, in our debates. We had no business being friends, but we were friends. Respected him a lot, and I'm going to miss him. His voice will be missed in this committee, where he served with conviction on behalf of Alaska and the country for 49 years. Congressman Young is lying in state today. Some of us had a chance to honor him in Statuary Hall, and I hope everyone who wants to do that will have the chance to go and honor his incredible legacy. So with Don in mind, let's turn our attention to the 3 pieces of legislation before us today. They focus on conserving unique animals and ecosystems and preventing human rights violations. The first bill we'll be hearing addresses the shortcomings revealed in a really important hearing that this subcommittee had on October 26th of last year regarding gross human rights violations in international conservation. Chair Grijalva, Ranking Member Westerman, and WOW Ranking Member Benz and I have worked together on this. We jointly introduced H.R. 7025, the Advancing Human Rights Centered International Conservation Act. This bill strengthens human rights standards for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's international conservation grants. In 2019, the Natural Resource Committee launched a multi-year bipartisan investigation into the World Wildlife Fund and Department of Interior's handling of human rights abuses against indigenous people and local community members at the hands of park rangers and eco-guards at parks around the world. Internal WWF reports revealed a long and disturbing history of these appalling abuses and revealed several deficiencies in WWF's practices and in Fish and Wildlife Service's grant funding and oversight processes. So this bill before us today will elevate the role of human rights in international grants by ensuring that the federal government funds do not go to recipients that have committed gross violations of human rights, and that recipients carry out projects under the highest human rights standards. It directs Fish and Wildlife Service to enhance project vetting and transparently investigate, report on, and respond to human rights abuses, suspending or terminating grants if necessary. The bill also directs the Fish and Wildlife Service to strengthen standards for the fair treatment of indigenous peoples and local communities. We're also hearing Representative Jeffries' bill, H.R. 6734, the Keep America's Refuges Operational Act. This will reauthorize the volunteer services, community partnerships, and refuge education programs of the National Wildlife Refuge System. The system spreads across 568 national wildlife refuges, protects nearly 837 million acres of land, water, and wetlands. These important lands serve as home for over 700 species of birds, 220 mammals, 1,000 different fish species, 250 reptile and amphibian species, and volunteers in the system are crucial to keeping the refuges running, encouraging millions of tourists each year, and generating billions in revenue while creating local jobs for neighboring communities. Reauthorizing these volunteer services allows the Fish and Wildlife Service to continue providing transportation, uniforms, lodging, awards, subsistence, and training for those who selflessly choose to volunteer on this work. Continuing the topic of refuges, the final bill is Representative Johnson's H.R. 6427, the Red River National Wildlife Refuge Boundary Modification Act. The bill adds 3,300 acres to the Red River National Wildlife Refuge, specifically to the acquisition boundary, which is the area from which more land can be added to the refuge. Additional land will support migratory birds throughout their annual life cycle of breeding, wintering, and migrating. The Red River Refuge provides fish, wildlife, and migratory bird habitat in the Red River Valley ecosystem, and this expansion will help support migratory bird species while providing additional economic benefits through partnerships with local farmers and increased public access for outdoor recreationists. I am eager to hear from my colleagues about their legislation. I look forward to the invaluable testimony of our invited witnesses. And with that, I will turn it over to Ranking Member Benz for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I join you in your remembrance of Congressman Don Young. What a great man, and what a unique personality. He is absolutely missed. With that, I welcome members and witnesses to today's hearing. This afternoon, we are considering 3 bills, all of which impact the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We appreciate the bipartisan nature of this hearing and hope that this bipartisanship will extend to holding a hearing on efforts to fix and address the frailties of the Endangered Species Act. H.R. 6427 by Mr. Johnson of Louisiana would amend the boundaries of the Red River National Wildlife Refuge in northwest Louisiana. The Red River National Wildlife Refuge was created by law in the year 2000 and has approximately 15,000 acres within it. This boundary adjustment would allow the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to purchase an additional 3,300 acre tract to meet 2 of the main purposes of the refuge, that is to restore and conserve native plants and animals and to provide habitat for migratory birds. H.R. 6734 by Mr. Jeffries would reauthorize for 5 years a number of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service programs, including those related to volunteer services, community partnerships, donations and gifts, and education programs. The Fish and Wildlife Service currently utilizes volunteers for tours, habitat restoration, plant and animal surveys, and more. These efforts allow the agency to get more work done without having to spend additional resources, which is appreciated during a time when our federal debt is out of control. Lastly, HR 7025 by Mr. Grijalva and Mr. Westerman, and which Chair Huffman and I have co-sponsored, would address the World Wildlife Foundation's egregious misuse of taxpayer money, which included funding paramilitary forces that committed human rights violations. The bill reflects an attempt to prevent this from happening again by making changes to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's International Conservation Grant Program. The changes include a new requirement for the agency to consider human rights abuses by conducting risk analyses, increased auditing of grants, and a new review process for the agency to review allegations to determine if the Office of Inspector General should investigate. Lastly, the bill makes grant recipients responsible for the actions of their subgrantees and requires grantees to report credible allegations of human rights abuse. I think we can all agree that the atrocities should never be funded by taxpayer dollars, and that I appreciate, and of course I appreciate the bipartisan work on developing this bill. I look forward to our panels of witnesses and to finding out more about these bills. I specifically would like to hear from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife about specific outcomes these bills would create rather than the broad statements and generalities found throughout the agency's written testimony. I thank our colleagues for their leadership, and I am happy to have the opportunity to help them in their efforts. With that, I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Ranking Member Benz. The chair of the full committee, Chairman Grijalva, is with us, and we will recognize you, Mr. Chairman, for 5 minutes.
Very much, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Benz. Appreciate you holding the hearing on HR 725 along with the other pieces of legislation, and also, of course, Ranking Member Westerman for working on this piece of legislation, a reaction to gross violations of human rights and abuse of taxpayer money, and the intention of what these programs should be about. And I believe the legislation, as outlined by the chairman, will begin that process of holding accountable and assuring that there is a process for accountability throughout the legislation, not just simply funding a program and then having to deal with their arrogance and lack of information as we were going through the trying to investigate and access the real truth here. It's a reaction to that, but I think a very solid and precedent, Mr. Chairman, and how indigenous concerns, particularly in the regions that we're talking about where the abuse occurred, but indigenous concerns being integrated fully into part of the process, an important part of the process, is very important. And I want to thank all of you, yourself, the ranking member of the subcommittee, and Mr. Westerman for their work on this, and yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I now recognize Ranking Member Westerman.
Thank you, Chairman Huffman and Ranking Member Benz, Chairman Grijalva.
Thank you, Darrell.
Wonderful to be having this bipartisan hearing today. And I'm glad that today's hearing, which allows for us and the witnesses to attend in person, features 3 relatively non-controversial common sense bills related to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The first bill, authored by Chairman Grijalva and me, as well as Chairman Huffman and Ranking Member Benz, is H.R. 725, the Advancing Human Rights-Centered International Conservation Act of 2022. This bill is the result of a bipartisan investigation on how the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's International Grant Program helped fund human rights atrocities committed by ECHO paramilitary forces in Africa and elsewhere. This investigation led to last year's oversight hearing and ultimately to the introduction of this bill. The fundamental concepts of this bill are agency accountability and transparency. This bill specifically requires that the agency vet the human rights record of conservation groups and their subgrantees prior to awarding a grant. The inclusion of subgrantees is critical. Unfortunately, we have seen some conservation groups avoid taking responsibility for the actions of their subgrantees. The bill also gives the Fish and Wildlife Service the authority to initiate investigations should it receive credible information regarding human rights violations from other sources. Just as important, the service would be required to conduct regular audits of their grants. Alarmingly, the service has previously relied on grant recipients themselves to audit the use of grant funds. As a result, agency officials were unaware of several allegations of human rights abuses raised by our committees and the media's investigations. This bill is a much-needed and significant change from the status quo. We always don't agree on everything. That's the way our founders set it up to be. But this is an issue where we have come together to ensure conservation efforts do not occur at the cost of human lives or human rights violations. I do again thank Chair Grijalva and his staff for their cooperation on this bill, and I also want to thank Mr. John Knox, who is here today testifying in support of the bill. Mr. Knox's expertise and his dedication to remedying these issues has been a key in getting this bill where it is today. The other two bills before us seek to improve the National Wildlife Refuge System. The bills introduced by our colleagues, Mr. Jeffries, Mr. Whitman, and Mr. Graves, reauthorizes volunteer programs at our National Wildlife Refuges. I commend them for their leadership on this bill. And the other bill is H.R. 6427, introduced by our Louisiana colleague, Mike Johnson, and its purpose is to revise the boundary of the Red River National Wildlife Refuge. This bill could lead to expanded hunting and related waterfowl conservation opportunities on a 3,300-acre tract that could be purchased in part by federal duck stamp sales. And should a duck navigate its way through my district in South Arkansas and the many duck hunters there, this would provide a much-needed resting place before the Louisiana hunters got after it. I commend Mr. Johnson for introducing this bill, and I also want to welcome Mr. Ed Penny, the Southern Region's Policy Director for Ducks Unlimited, who is here also to testify. Promoting access to our national wildlife refuges and other federal lands and waters is one of the most important things that we can do in this committee. Hunters, anglers, and trappers that use our refuges in Arkansas and elsewhere play key financial and social roles in conserving our fish and wildlife for generations to come. Our former Dean of the House, he fundamentally believed in this mission as a founding member of the Congressional Sportsmen's Caucus. And it is odd to think that he's not here with us today. I noticed his name tag is still out, but I think this is the kind of legislation that Don Young always championed, and he would definitely be behind this. He was a true legend in the hunting and fishing communities, and today we honor him not only in this hearing, but in the House as a whole for his leadership. In conclusion, I want to thank everyone for their participation, and I look forward to today's hearing. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Westerman. So this is a legislative hearing, so our first panel is a congressional panel for members to speak to their bills on the agenda. And since Chairman Grijalva has already given an opening statement, we will turn to Representative Mike Johnson from Louisiana and hear about H.R. 6427. Mr. Johnson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Huffman and Ranking Member Bentz and full committee Chairman Grijalva, Ranking Member Westerman, and Mr. Fulcher, and all the members of the subcommittee. I know those are watching on video. It is really good to be back before the committee that our late colleague, Congressman Don Young, truly loved, and it was great to see his passion. We learned a lot from him. Our prayers are with his family today and all the people of the state that he loves so much, Alaska, to whom, after nearly a half century of Don's representation, it must be difficult to imagine someone else filling that seat. So our thoughts and prayers are with the family. I am grateful to have H.R. 6427, the Red River National Wildlife Refuge Boundary Modification Act, before you today. This is a very straightforward bill that addresses a really simple problem, but it's one that's very important to my district, and as was noted, there are a handful of ducks that do make its way through Mr. Westerman's district in South Arkansas to North Louisiana, so we need all the help we can get because we'd like to have more. For years, the Red River Wildlife Refuge in Northwest Louisiana has been a boon for hunters and outdoorsmen and other recreationists, and just last year it hosted over 200,000 visits. For reference, that's greater than the population of Shreveport, Louisiana, my hometown, which is also the largest city in my district. Thousands of these visitors went to the refuge for the express purpose of hunting and fishing. It's a beautiful place. The refuge truly has contributed to our state's status as what we call the sportsman's paradise, and it's a sentiment Louisianians hold so dearly that we print it as a nickname on every license plate in the state. The refuge's stated goal is to provide for the restoration and conservation of fish and wildlife habitat, including migratory birds, within the Red River Valley ecosystem. However, the refuge's current structure is insufficient to meet the goals that have been set by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, especially for migratory waterfowl. Those stated energy goals are measured in waterfowl energy days, which, as you all know, is a unit of measurement equal to the energy needs of one mallard-sized duck for 1 day during the winter. The refuge's aim is to produce a total of 8.3 million of these waterfowl energy days, which would support roughly 136,000 ducks and geese. Currently, the refuge produces only 2.8 million waterfowl energy days, meaning it can only support 1/3 of the birds it's supposed to support and intended to support. Fortunately, there is a solution to the shortfall. My bill that I bring to you today would help address the refuge's waterfowl energy day deficiency by modifying the refuge boundary to include 3,300 acres. It's a tract of privately owned land for the purpose of eventually incorporating the tract into the refuge. And the boundary modification would not alter the authorized acreage of the refuge. It would still keep the refuge within its current authorized size. The Fish and Wildlife Service anticipates the tract could produce at least 3 million waterfowl energy days, which would cut the current deficit by more than half. It would also more than double current waterfowl energy day production, and this addition to the refuge is necessary. It's necessary for it to continue its support of continental waterfowl populations and other wetland-dependent migratory bird species. The Fish and Wildlife Service anticipates there will be benefits to the local economy as well through partnerships with agricultural producers, greater public access to hunters and other recreationists, greater waterfowl distribution throughout the region as populations migrate out from the refuge. Some may even go to South Arkansas, I'm not sure. As a former member of this committee, I know how much you all value local sentiment when weighing federal land management policy, and that's the way it should be. We've spent a tremendous amount of time, speaking with stakeholders on this issue, engaging their feedback, and I'm proud to tell you that every single state and local legislator, the state senators, state representatives of this area, including the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, the Louisiana Department of Agriculture and Forestry, Louisiana Forestry Association, several members of the local parish commission, and nearby landowners are all in favor of this. I want to reiterate that we were very targeted with this bill. The only change we're proposing is to make the refuge boundary to include this tract from a private landowner, and the owner of this tract is certainly a willing seller. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has told us they want to acquire it, the hunters want to hunt it, and I'm sure the geese and ducks want to eat there. So this is pro-conservation, pro-hunting, pro-agriculture, pro-outdoor recreation, and it's bipartisan. Doesn't get any better than that. In closing, I just want to thank all of you for your time, including this bill in today's hearing. It's extremely important to my district, my constituents, and I'm looking forward to working with you all to advance it, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Unless any members have questions for Mr. Johnson about his bill?
Oh. Garrett is jealous because he's in South Louisiana, and the
Congressman
prettiest part of the
Graves
state.
is showing incredible restraint. So we will let you go. Thanks very much for your good work on this bill.
Thank you.
And we'll now transition to our second panel to hear testimony from the administration witness. Let me remind our witnesses that under committee rules, they should limit their oral statement to 5 minutes, but the entire written statement will appear in the record. When you begin, the timer will begin and turn orange when you have 1 minute left. I recommend that members and witnesses who are joining us remotely lock the timer so that it remains visible. And then after your testimony is complete, please do remember to mute yourself. Our administration witness today is Mr. Stephen Girton, Deputy Director of Policy for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The chair now recognizes Mr. Girton for 5 minutes. Is your microphone on, Mr. Girton? There we go.
Can you hear me now, sir?
Yes, sir.
Sorry
Thank
about
you.
that. Good afternoon, Chair Huffman, Ranking Member Bentz, and members of the subcommittee. I'm Steve Girton, Deputy Director for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. With the Chair's permission, before I begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the consequential and positive impact that Congressman Don Young has had on the Fish and Wildlife Service. Among his many durable legislative accomplishments to conserve fish and wildlife is the National Wildlife Refuge System Improvement Act, for which he was the lead sponsor. The law was a tremendous step forward for species conservation. It is the foundation of the modern refuge system and has affected our work in every state on every day since its passage a quarter century ago. Congressman Young was also a leader on cornerstone laws like the multinational species conservation funds that conserve species abroad and the Pittman-Robertson and Dingell-Johnson programs that conserve species here in America. We're grateful for his legislative accomplishments to advance our mission. They'll resonate long into the future. We honor his leadership of Dean of the House and former chair of this committee and express our deepest condolences to his family, friends, and colleagues, and to his staff. Regarding the 3 bills under consideration today, we appreciate the subcommittee's continued interest and support for our conservation mission. Our written testimony discusses the department's views on each of these bills, and I will provide brief remarks to summarize them. First, we support the Red River National Wildlife Refuge Boundary Modification Act, which would expand the refuge's acquisition boundary to include prime waterfowl habitat near the Bayou Pierre unit. If acquired, the lands and waters in the expanded acquisition boundary would achieve refuge conservation and management objectives. They would create additional opportunities for waterfowl hunting and wildlife watching and would expand access to nature for nearby urban communities. The Keep America's Refuges Operational Act of 2022 would reauthorize the refuge system's volunteer programs, community partnerships, and education programs from fiscal year 2022 to 2026. These programs are essential to accomplishing our conservation mission, and the service supports the legislation. Volunteers and partners enable our refuges to complete an enormous volume of work that otherwise would not be accomplished. Volunteers generously donate their time to accomplish maintenance, visitor services, education, and scientific projects at refuges nationwide. Up just a few years ago, we celebrated the most recent reauthorization of these programs down at the Rappahannock National Wildlife Refuge, and we look forward to continuing to recognize these programs with continued work with the leadership and members of this committee. Finally, the service supports the goals of advancing Human Rights-Centered International Conservation Act of 2022. This legislation would provide the service and the department with additional tools to respond to credible allegations of human rights violations. We have long recognized the importance of investing in wildlife and also in people, but we acknowledge that we need to strengthen our engagement with local and indigenous communities in a way that addresses historic injustice. Many of the species of the greatest conservation need live in areas plagued by conflict and weak governance. The service's investment in these areas can improve safety, governance, and stability for local communities. However, there's also inherent risk in working in these regions, including the possibility of human rights abuses. We have been reassessing our approach to international conservation. We've taken steps to implement better safeguards, but we do need to do more. We acknowledge the impact of our role, recognize the risks of our work today, and are charting a path forward toward a more just and inclusive future. We look forward to working with you on this as we move forward. We appreciate your interest in advancing wildlife conservation to achieve better outcomes for both wildlife and people, and would be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Girton. We'll now bring it back to the members for questions, and I'll begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. So, Mr. Girton, going back to our subcommittee's hearing in October on the international conservation subject, one of the things we discussed was this seemingly obvious principle that entities should not be investigating themselves after an alleged violation of human rights. But that is what happened in this case. After, in 2019, after the BuzzFeed articles came out, your agency stood by and waited for WWF to do its own investigation before deciding how to move forward. In the end, I'm grateful that the Fish and Wildlife Service did proceed with audits and investigations in parallel to WWF doing its internal investigation. But that's what they should have been doing from the start. That's what Fish and Wildlife Service should have been doing from the start. So I want to ask you about how we move forward. What new protocols are in place to ensure the service isn't just relying on the results of an organization's self-investigation? That's the first question. And then second, what would the tools in today's bill, H.R. 7025, do to help you carry out better oversight and management of these grants and do it more transparently?
Thank you for your question, Chairman Huffman. Sure, we have established a series of new rigorous protocols and procedures and regulations going forward. We're building on the legislation that was included in the 2020 Omnibus Appropriation Bill that requires us now to include 4 paramount criteria in all grants going forward. One, building in requirements for free and prior informed consent for local people when we operate in any geographies. 2, to consider impacts that may be caused to people in any geographies we operate in, making sure that there's built-in training and protocols for any law enforcement involved, and then there is established grievance mechanisms as well that are established. We signed a formal agreement with the U.S. Agency for International Development and are parroting their protocols into ours under this. And again, that was language included in the recent Omnibus Appropriations Bill. In addition, the department has implemented a rigorous new financial reporting system, Grant Solutions. Gives us a lot more visibility into all financial transactions and grant awards and reporting accountabilities. We do financial risk assessments, and as we're coming out of the return to work or return to offices, a lot more employees will be available to do some in-country visits this coming field season and going forward as well. As to new tools in the legislation, we support all of the goals of this legislation. We particularly are very interested in working with the committee on the reporting requirements, have an independent OIG, for example, doing any allegation studies and evaluations that come out of it, as well as some of the other requirements, and have a lot of interest in working with committee to finalize the way that legislation shapes up.
Appreciate that, Mr. Curtin. Do you agree that it is prudent to weave human rights standards into the grant contracts themselves as we've laid out in HR 7025?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we in the administration certainly do.
All right, thank you. I want to shift gears to the volunteer programs at the refuges. Could you tell us, please, the status of the report on volunteer programs and community partnerships, which is required under Section 7F of the Fish and Wildlife Act of 1956, as I understand it?
Thank you for your question, Mr. Chairman. We should have that report into review this week. I apologize for its tardiness. We do a lot of reporting through the budget process and our performance requirements that has that data readily available, but we have to get you a formal report to encapsulate all of it in a more formal transmission, and that should be coming up pretty soon.
All right, we appreciate that as well, and thanks very much for sharing your tribute to Congressman Don Young. We appreciate that. Ranking Member Bentz, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Mr. Gurdon, for the opportunity to discuss these issues yesterday. Appreciate it. A couple of questions. I'm actually looking at excuse me, page 4 of your testimony, HR 7025. Second paragraph where you say 7025 would prohibit the service from supporting a foreign security force if there is a credible allegation of human rights violation, unless effective steps have been taken to bring the offenders to justice. Have the offenders in the past been brought to justice?
Sir, there have been some criminal prosecutions that arise out of those. There were terminations of employment and other things like that in some of the countries where this funding was previously provided. We're not really involved in the disciplinary aspect of previous allegations or resolution of those, and I think going forward, a lot of the vision in this new legislation would give us a more proactive role in following up on some of that as well.
Okay, so you'll have to explain that in more detail. I don't know how legislation passed here in the United States is going to affect folks in a foreign country. So tell me why you think that this law is going to give you that additional help.
It'll give the U.S. more teeth when we write these contracts going forward, a lot more enforcement and ability like that. And with all these reporting requirements that are coming online with the new legislation, if passed, I think a lot more sensitivity and awareness early in the process if there are emerging rumors of allegations or if indeed allegations themselves are reported. And so this will just give us a lot more visibility into what's going on the ground.
Now, continuing on that same paragraph, it states the service would welcome the opportunity to discuss some of the terms and definitions used in these sections to ensure clarity. So when are those conversations going to occur? Is this the opportunity right now, or how do you plan to bring that clarity you apparently need? And you might want to explain what you mean by clarity. What's not clear enough?
Sure. Thank you for your question, Ranking Member Benza. We're hopeful that we can start sharing the views of the department and the service and the administration during the course of this hearing and with our questions for the record, then working with your staff to maybe fine-tune some of the provisions of the legislation as it works its way up the line. There's a couple of technical issues we'd like to work with committee staff on, some of the definitions in there. And then there's this vision revolving around the Leahy vetting, where the legislation would direct us to do a parallel process that DOD currently does or is housed currently in the State Department. We'd like to talk more with committee staff about how that would work in the real world. We're not sure we have the diplomatic authorities or the know-how to do that kind of work as a wildlife management agency, and maybe working more closely with State Department on those Leahy protocols would be a good example of the kind of technical discussions we want to have with committee staff.
Right, and that kind of brings us to your third paragraph, second sentence, where you say 7025 would require the Service and Department of State to share lists of foreign security forces receiving financial support and to vet those individuals. So how does that vetting actually occur?
Under current practice, Ranking Member Bench, we rely on the screening done by the Leahy process. That is all funding we receive through the Foreign Assistance Act. That's that CARPE money that comes to us from the AID. For your information and awareness, a lot of our other international grant programs like the Multinational Species Conservation Fund don't have a Leahy screening requirement for them as well. We'd like to have that protocol applied to all of our work that we do in the international arena. That's the people who are trained to evaluate what's going on in these countries, have knowledge about military, paramilitary, law enforcement, and other functions, and we want to be part of that larger process for all of our grant program portfolio.
Right, and I noticed in the last sentence it says, and to discuss alternatives to ensure the most effective. What alternatives?
What I'm talking about, Ranking Member Benz, this idea of not having the legislation direct the service to do or have in-house capacity to do our own vetting of these groups over there, but use some of these established processes. It also gives us that arm's distance approach. If we're evaluating our own grants, we think it's a stronger business practice to have State Department or an external entity being the one doing these evaluations for us.
On page 5, third paragraph, last sentence, it says, however, there is also an inherent risk in working in these regions that can impact the service's work, including human rights abuses, corruption, or abuse. That almost looks like an excuse. Is it your thought that no matter what you do, vetting or otherwise, it's not going to work just because of the nature of the societies in which you are operating?
No, sir, we're not trying to make it an excuse or get out of our responsibilities at all. It's just we want to make sure folks are aware certain parts of the country don't have the strong safeguards in place that a democracy like the U.S. might have necessarily. And when we're operating in some of these environments, different protocols and rules are in place. And so we all just have to be aware of manage the risk of what may be going on in other corners of the world, sir.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Chairman Grijalva for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Curtin, thank you for being here. Actually, in your responses to Chairman Huffman's questions, much about the tools and the authorities that are within the legislation presently, if they work, they would help with this critical work that this legislation is addressing. And your response to that basically took care of my question, to be honest with you. And but I did, you know, if the chair will indulge, you can't help but sitting around here today and be thinking about Don Young, you know. And when I got in this committee a short time ago, I sat down here when you start out, you know, and Don Young sat up there. He's always sat up there since I got to Congress. And behind me, where I'm sitting now, were the Udall cousins, Tom and Mark. And it was one of like my first meetings. And they got me all excited because they were going to give me an amendment or something for you can have your day in the sun, Raúl, because you're our friend. And so I'm down there, they hand me the amendment, I start to go into it. I'm maybe, if I'm lucky, maybe 40 seconds into the statement, when Don Young yield as much time as he will ever consume to himself and proceeded to educate me, berate me, and basically put me in my place relative to the point that I was talking about something about Alaska, which was, I remember, mistake number one. Mistake number two was trusting the Udall cousins, that they were laughing so hard that they had to walk out of the door. That was my initial baptism with Don Young. And I don't think I'm the only one a member of Congress that can speak to that on both sides of the aisle. On both sides of the aisle. And so, yeah, he'll be missed. He had a fierce loyalty to his people in Alaska, as he said. He had a brief loyalty to the topic that we're talking about today, human rights and this legislation. And generally, the disagreement with Don Young was such that you knew you disagreed. But Don Young was also such that afterwards he goes, "Are you angry, little buddy?" You know? And I think we missed that kind of demeanor here, and it'll be missed in him. Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sounds like the reception I got when I carried the bill to prevent drilling in the
Yes.
Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. You really loved that one.
We thought you would like that particular bill.
Thank you very much. Ranking Member Westerman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. Could tell a lot of Don Young stories, but I want to ask some questions. Again, a lot of these questions have been addressed already, but Mr. Gurdon, I just want to run this by you again. Does the service currently conduct programmatic audits of the international conservation groups?
Yes, sir. We conduct audits. Right now, they're desk audits because we're not been deployed over to some of these countries, but we do them with the information we have available. Yes, sir.
And does the service have a process in place to find out how federal dollars were spent by the grantees?
We rely on our financial tracking system, sir. We rely on generated reports that they provide to us. We rely on our interviews and reports we get from our partner organizations. And then now that COVID protocols are being eased, we'll have targeted targeted teams going to targeted grant recipients in some of these countries starting this field season to do more on-the-site, on-the-job audits and evaluations.
I want to shift a little bit to Mr. Johnson's bill. When I first heard about it, I had a little bit of heartburn about it because you're taking land and putting it under the management of Fish and Wildlife. And my big concern is what assurances do we have that this property is going to be managed properly? And what assurances can we have with that?
Mr. Chairman, if the bill is enacted and this is expanded as a potential expansion for the refuge, you have our pledge that we will manage it appropriately. We will manage it in accordance with the law, the Refuge Improvement Act. The focus will be, as you heard from the bill sponsor, a lot of interest in waterfowl production, and he very eloquently described our science behind it, the waterfowl energy days that we use calculations. We see this emerging as a big addition to our ability to provide outdoor recreation opportunities, both for hunters as well as bird watchers. And the refuge, if this passes and we move forward with the land acquisition, it'll be part of that larger flyway where we work across the distribution of the species and work with all of the state partners and other landowners. But this is a very good conservation measure, and we support it, and we'll go through the Migratory Bird Conservation Council would be the most likely source to provide the funding for it, and that means it would come through Congress for approval if we move forward with an acquisition.
So that the services practice to maximize those energy days where waterfowl are concerned?
Yes, sir. As the bill sponsor explained, We have a deficit there. This additional habitat would allow us to essentially produce forage for overwintering ducks in this geography every winter to prepare them for their migration up to the prairie pothole region and elsewhere for the breeding season. And then coming back down, it would provide additional opportunities for sportsmen throughout the flyway.
Yeah, so I've got a refuge in my district, Hollow Bend National Wildlife Refuge, that I'm planning to visit soon. So I haven't seen this firsthand, but my constituents in the area tell me that that refuge is no longer managed to hold waterfowl, that it used to have a crop sharing program where the farmers got to farm the land, but they left part of the crop behind for waterfowl food. And apparently Fish and Wildlife has stopped that program, and as a result, there's not near as many ducks that winter there. So is there a different policy? You may have to get back to me on that. But it doesn't seem like Fish and Wildlife is trying to maximize energy days of food sources on that refuge.
Sure. Mr. Ranking Member, the specifics of that individual refuge, I would have to get back to you, but we can make a couple quick phone calls today and tomorrow and give your staff an update on what is the vision there, what our operating environment is looking like, and give you a larger briefing if interested in how we're using the refuge system to promote a lot of this habitat for migration, for waterfowl, for other bird species, and how it ties in with the flyways and this great partnership we have with the states on a joint vision for conservation.
All right, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Chairman Lowenthal for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chairman Huffman. And as I ask my questions, I just want to also follow your lead and Mr. Westerman and others, ranking member, in sharing my thoughts about Don Young. I will truly miss Don Young. I don't even recall what the issue was. It was during, I think, my first or my second term here in Congress, but the first time I really interacted with Don, he was so angry at me. He cursed at me and he was so angry, but then he invited me up to his office and we had a talk. I can just tell you, my respect for him has grown and grown years, and so I too will miss him greatly. But my question is to Mr. Girton. I think that it was nice to hear and how the safeguards that you've begun to put in, and it was in, to prevent human rights abuses. But the question I have is, right now, the human rights abuses that we've really studied were situations that BuzzFeed coverage provided. Can you tell us whether you have identified other kinds of human rights abuses that BuzzFeed did not cover, and how did you implement changes in those areas, if you can address that if it's possible?
Thank you for your question, Congressman. When the allegations rise after that BuzzFeed article, I can report that the service did a comprehensive review of all of our grants that might have been operating in that geography. We did not necessarily uncover any direct linkage between our funding and the recipients of those grants and what was actually going on the ground. We are continuing to do those kind of evaluations, and we're continuing to do that kind of program management effectively. And then that's why we're so intrigued with this legislation. If it comes online, I think it'll give us a more robust series of tools that the service can use to have more safeguards in place, building on the 4 that are included in the omnibus spending bill a couple of years ago that are now part of our joint work with AID. And we'll be pleased to provide you and other members up here updates throughout the coming year to let you see how these new protocols are coming online.
Thank you. My other questions, I think you've addressed some of them, but I'm still going to ask you. Have you identified previous allegations of human rights abuses that potentially occurred before BuzzFeed and your investigations? Can you assure us that the oversights that we witnessed in our bipartisan investigation don't ever occur again. Can you assure us that these will not occur again?
Thank you for your question, Congressman. To the best of my knowledge, we're not aware of any earlier allegations that have surfaced. But again, that's to the best of my knowledge. And you can have my assurance as an employee of the Fish and Wildlife Service, we will certainly do everything we can in our power to do a more credible and effective response going forward. If this legislation is passed, we will certainly implement it with the best of our due diligence and authorities. And I think I can speak for all of our folks in the Fish and Wildlife Service. Yes, we will be very dedicated to this additional mission requirement as well.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Whitman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank Deputy Director Gerton for joining us today. I want to speak in strong favor of Keeping America's Refuges Operational Act. This bill, H.R. 6734, continues for another 5 years, the program where we advocate for our volunteers to help out on our refuges. These are things like community partnerships where citizens want to give of their time or give other donations and gifts and help out with education programs. We know that when we have our citizens involved with our wildlife refuges, it's incredibly important. And I want to thank my friend from New York, Mr. Jeffries, for sponsoring this bill and for reaching out to me to be part of this. We think this is incredibly important. This is one of the places, too, you heard a lot of testimony here about Don Young. This is one place where Don Young was incredibly passionate about, and that is involving citizens in taking care of the resources that have been bestowed upon us by our Creator. He felt very strongly about that and was passionate about Alaska. In fact, he encouraged me many times. He said, "You've got to come to Alaska." Well, Don, if you're listening, I will be going to Alaska. So we'll make sure that we get there and honor his service to our nation and his incredible passion for our natural resources. This bill will allow citizens that do such an extraordinary job at our National Wildlife Refuges. In fact, even in the face of COVID-19, over 11,000 volunteers contributed last year, over 68,000 volunteer hours to our refuges. That's incredible. Of our 567 refuges, 14 are in Virginia, one right in my backyard. I grew up spending many days in what is today the Rappahannock River Valley Wildlife Refuge, an incredible national asset. I know that we're going to hear later from Ms. Patterson about the incredible value of that refuge and all the things that our citizens do in that refuge. The friends of the Rappahannock River Valley Wildlife Refuge are incredible in things that they do, and I want to make sure that we are recognizing their contributions and make sure that they can continue to do that work. That's an incredible national asset. I know that if you just look at the value of the hours that have been contributed towards helping our refuges, it totals over $18.5 million, a pretty incredible contribution. So while folks also provide the resources through their tax dollars to our nation's wildlife refuges, they also provide that sweat equity that we know is incredibly important to the things that we need to do to make sure that our refuges are accessible and, again, are conduits for our citizens to be involved with the natural resources that we have there before us. And I know that this legislation has broad support across the spectrum from folks not only within the agency but across our communities, across the interest groups that represent our natural resources. So we thank them for their support of this. Thank the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and members of Congress for their support in this bill. This is the kind of way that we can effectively involve citizens with their government and where they can see the fruits of their labor. So Deputy Director Gerton, thank you for your advocacy. Ms. Patterson, thanks so much for your advocacy and the things that have been done by the Friends groups, not only in the Rappahannock River Valley area, but also across the nation. And I'd like to thank my colleague Garrett Graves. He's also a co-sponsor of this legislation, which is, as I said, something that all of us feel deeply about, and again, a great legacy to Don Young, who was adamant about having the opportunity there for our citizens who own these resources, or who are stewards, I should say, of these resources from the bestowment from our Creator that He provides us for, and we have an obligation to make sure we're doing everything we can to protect these resources. So again, Mr. Chairman, I thank you. Thank you for holding today's hearing. I want to thank Mr. Jeffries for his leadership and support on this piece of legislation. Thank Ranking Member Bentz, too, for his leadership there. And I look forward to this becoming law. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Whitman. So batting cleanup on this panel will be the congressman that Don Young affectionately referred to as Red Snapper, Congressman Graves from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just quickly want to also make mention of Chairman Emeritus Don Young's passing. I had the chance to work with him since the mid-1990s, and just an absolute lion. The guy was amazing, and I know in many cases the press portrayed him in a way that I think people in this panel, both Republicans and Democrats, would say wasn't what we really saw in a man. And the guy was just a fierce fighter and defender of Alaska, and going to be a huge loss to this committee and this body. And I know that everybody on this committee feels that loss, and I really hate to see what happened. Just an amazing man, and I know we're having a special order tonight and have a chance to talk a little bit more about him. But Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the bipartisan legislation that's being discussed today. I think it's great, and I think this committee needs to do a hell of a lot more of it, a lot more bipartisan work. And I don't care who's in charge. I think this committee needs to do more bipartisan work, because we end up passing bills out that are unilateral bills, that are partisan bills. They never go anywhere, and it ends up just being a complete waste of time. But I'll tell you something that also is bipartisan, and that's the fact that what's happening right now with energy and electricity prices is affecting Republicans and Democrats across the United States. It's affecting independents, it's affecting rich, poor, whatever title, status, or label you want to apply to people. It's affecting everybody. This committee has jurisdiction over energy. And we're not doing anything. We're not having hearings. We're not doing bills. We're not going back and looking at all of the unforced errors that put us in this situation. What we're experiencing today was preventable. And not just preventable, it's things that people actually raised and said was going to happen. I'll admit, it happened a hell of a lot faster than I thought it was, because of the Ukraine debacle and Vladimir Putin's absurd aggression. But this is bipartisan, and this is this committee's jurisdiction. Yes, I support the legislation that's before us, and I love that we're doing bipartisan things, but there has not been a single hearing, not a single bill, no review, no oversight, no nothing. Think for just a minute. If Donald Trump were in the White House and if Democrats were in charge of this committee, they would be dragging every Interior, Department of Energy, EPA, and every other official they could think of, from the VA probably, up here kicking and screaming before this committee and doing exams on these folks, up one side, down the other. What's happening right now, these are unforced errors. Saying no to everything is not an energy policy. President Obama used to talk about all of the above energy. All of the above energy. And that means solar and wind and hydrogen and geothermal and nuclear and wave and everything else, including conventional fuels like oil and gas. This administration's Energy Information Agency has said that there's going to be a 50% increase in global energy demand. 50%, which includes an increase in oil, and it includes an increase in natural gas. Are we gonna continue to go down this path of following in the footsteps of what the UK has done? Look at what's going on in Germany right now. Look at the wind debacle that they had in the UK previously. Why in the world would we not learn from the mistakes and learn from the successes of different states in the United States and other countries versus going down this exact path that has been proven to completely fail? And let me be clear, when I say fail on prices, fail on emissions in the environment, and fail on energy security. Why would we do that? We have blocked energy projects from moving forward in the United States, only to become more dependent upon Russian energy. We're now turning to Iran, Venezuela, and Saudi Arabia to fill the void. We have blocked access to rare earth or critical minerals in the United States, even though Russia, China, and other nations we don't have allies, we don't have a secure supply chain with, have stepped in and monopolized these resources, preventing us from having a renewable energy industry in the United States. Shame on us, Mr. Chairman, for not stepping up and addressing this issue that is a bipartisan issue that is affecting all of our constituents, especially those that are most impoverished and those that are on fixed income. And so I urge that we use this committee's jurisdiction in a way that is appropriate and a way that
Thank you, Mr. Graves.
I think Don Young would have done. I yield
Yeah,
back.
the gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Graves, you've taken us far afield of the subject we were here today to discuss, but you are right. We share, there is a bipartisan outrage about the war that has been brought to us by fossil fuel and financed by fossil fuel, but a point of clarification since Chairman Grijalva is here. Mr. Chairman, I believe you had invited some of the CEOs from major oil companies who actually have been doing a lot of business with Vladimir Putin over the years, developing his wealth and oil influence, but also sitting on thousands of unused oil leases while opposing the clean energy transition. What was the response when you invited them to come to this committee and testify in a hearing?
Parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Chairman.
No, I'm asking the gentleman a
Parliamentary inquiry, Mr.
question that's
Chairman.
directly responsive to
Parliamentary
your...
inquiry, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Grijalva.
Mr. Chairman, on the committee
they
rules,
denied.
doesn't
They
a
denied.
parliamentary inquiry govern?
What is the gentleman's inquiry?
I'm just curious, you just spoke for 90 seconds. I'm just curious whose time that was.
It's a procedural clarification that we...
Speaking for 90 seconds is a procedural, okay, well, may I clarify the inaccurate statements that you just made?
Mr. Graves, you're really going to object about taking liberties with time?
I just want to ask if I can respond to the inaccurate comments. This is a committee.
No,
This is
the
the United
gentleman
States
cannot,
Congress,
and I
it's
appreciate
inappropriate
Chairman
for us
Grijalva's
to be telling
clarification.
people in the public that
I
there
believe
are
Ms.
thousands of wells that
Napolitano-
people are sitting on. It's
The
not
gentleman
accurate.
is out of
It's
order.
not
Ms.
accurate.
Napolitano had a question. Ms. Napolitano, did you have a question for this panel?
I did, sir, and
You're
I thank
recognized.
Mr. Graves, and I share his outrage, but please, we must act in a civil manner. My question is, I haven't heard any conversation regarding climate change, especially as drought in the West, and I wondered if Mr. Byrne has any information for the committee as to what Fish and Wildlife is doing to ameliorate the impact that drought has had in the West.
Thank you for your question, Congresswoman. The Congress and administration worked together to pass the bipartisan infrastructure law that provided the Department of the Interior with significant resources to tackle the climate crisis.
I'm sorry, sir. That's all right. I understand that. But what is the department doing to help ameliorate it now? Not after the bill passes and the funding is available. What are you doing now?
Congressman, to clarify, we're using the funding right now that was provided to us in the bipartisan infrastructure law. Right now, we're working to get the significant resources from the Bureau of Reclamation out on the ground. Our own agency is doing a lot of work in the Klamath Basin with a big fish passage program to reopen spawning habitat. And so we're actually utilizing all of this BIL funding right now. In addition, we certainly take into account climatic projections in all of our ongoing work for the management of the refuge system, where we see a lot of sea level rise encroaching on habitats out there. We're doing a lot of work to evaluate species response in the light of climate change. And so it's part of our day-to-day operational mission imperatives, Congresswoman.
Well, I'd like to see what is being done in the western states, because I'm worried about the Salton Sea and some of the refuges up in Northern California that might have a decrease in availability of marshes.
Thank you for your question, Congresswoman. I would have to get you some more details on the specific program implementation we're doing in the Salton Sea. I can reaffirm we're aware there's an ongoing problem there, particularly with avian influenza outbreaks and bird die-offs and things like that. But we'll get you some more current updates on the specifics of Salton Sea remediation for the record.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, I'd like to hear what Mr. Grijalva, yield to Mr. Grijalva to answer the question you had.
All right, Chairman Grijalva,
No,
you've
no.
got the remaining time.
Thank you, and thank the gentlelady for her graciousness. Let me just say that the issue that none of these companies that we invited that do business on public land and waters, they turned down the invitation. We'll explore what path next in terms of compelling and other issues. But, you know, when we talk about this subject, and the debate should be a balanced discussion, and when we're only being blamed, and why I say being blamed, because of what has occurred in Ukraine, supply chain, etc., that the only way to resolve it is to go back to a medieval time and just basically open up everything for the taking. And this is going to solve our problem. Many of us don't believe that. We don't believe that that is a solution. In fact, it's digging the hole deeper. So I want to get a balance from industry. I want to get real information, because it's, you know, the energy policy is not going to be resolved by the particular midterm election talking points. They're going to be resolved by dealing with this issue. And I'm not afraid to deal with it, but in a comprehensive, everything on the table manner, not just one side. Thank you.
All right.
I reclaim my time as chair. I'd like to hear from Mr. Gurn to the committee any reports on how they're dealing with climate change and how it's affecting some of the areas that are fowl and fish are experiencing the effects of, if you will.
Did you want to respond, Mr. Gurdon?
So thank you for your question, Congressman. Our mission charges us to work on wildlife and fisheries issues day to day. We are evaluating what we're seeing with climatic impacts causing any potential. We're all seeing, for example, the phenology of a lot of North America's has changed. Migratory bird patterns and other species are moving at different times of the year. A great example is the monarch butterfly. We're trying to be proactive about things on wildlife corridors and working with agriculture and other interested segments to build corridors for species like the monarch and other pollinators. We're certainly keeping an eye on all of our waterfowl and other geese and duck populations. You know, the service has been petitioned through the years to evaluate the status of species in response to climate change, and so we do a rigorous scientific evaluation of those. But that's what we do for a living, Congresswoman. We're evaluating impacts to fishing.
No, but you know it and you report it, but do we know it? Do we have a report on that in the committee? We are aware of what areas are experiencing more of an impact. Like I understand now that the weather pattern is turning up the northwest, and the climate change is completely gone haywire.
So the gentlelady's time has expired, but I believe she's asking for any recent reports on climate impacts to these areas that we've been discussing, to the extent that Mr. Gurton, you and your team could work with the gentlelady to get her.
We'd be glad to provide copies, web links, or more helpful, we'd be glad to offer a briefing for her and her staff or any other interested members.
Thank you very much. We'll now transition to the third and final panel of expert witnesses. I'll remind non-administration witnesses to please participate in the witness diversity survey that we've created through the Congressional Office of Diversity and Inclusion. Witnesses can refer to their hearing invitation materials for further information about that. Also, again, witnesses for our third panel, please remember to mute yourself when you're not speaking to avoid inadvertent background noise, and I'll allow all the witnesses to testify before we bring it back to the members for questions. For our final panel, we will first hear from Mr. John Knox, Professor of International Law at Wake Forest University and former UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. Mr. Knox, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member Bentz, Chairman Grijalva, and Ranking Member Westerman, I just want to thank you for inviting me to speak to you again. I would especially like to thank Ranking Member Westerman for his kind words directed toward me. When I testified before this subcommittee in October 2021, I welcomed your attention to this crucial issue and expressed the hope that it would result in new legislation strengthening U.S. standards for the protection of human rights and conservation. I'm therefore delighted that you have introduced this bill that would provide for exactly that kind of protection. The timing of the bill is especially important because governments are currently negotiating a new global biodiversity framework that will set goals for conservation for 2030 and beyond. And one of the goals of this framework will be for each country to designate 30% of its territory as protected for conservation by the year 2030. If met, this 30 by 30 goal would effectively double the area of the planet designated for conservation. Strengthening international conservation is vital to addressing the global biodiversity crisis, but as I and other speakers explained in our testimony in October, the most effective way to do this is by respecting the rights of the indigenous peoples and local communities who are already working to protect natural ecosystems from destruction. Unfortunately, rather than protect their rights, many governments and conservation organizations have violated them. Pursuing fortress conservation, they have excluded indigenous peoples and local communities from their ancestral lands and territories, and this has directly led to further human rights abuses, because when these people have tried to return to their homes, they've been treated as criminals and subjected to beatings and detention and even torture, rape, and murder. While the direct perpetrators of these abuses are park rangers and eco guards, others are implicated as well. Conservation organizations such as the World Wildlife Fund have provided and continue to provide hundreds of millions of dollars in financial and technical support to national parks and protected areas, and conservation organizations often co-manage these protected areas, including the areas where many of the alleged abuses have occurred. As the investigation conducted by this subcommittee has shown, conservation organizations have simply not had sufficient safeguards in place to prevent human rights violations and to respond effectively to them. Making matters worse, conservation organizations like WWF have refused and continue to refuse to take responsibility for their failures, including, of course, at the October hearing. Donors to international conservation also have a responsibility to ensure that their funds, including, of course, U.S. taxpayer dollars, are not being used to support human rights violations. Donor agencies, including the Fish and Wildlife Service, need to do a better job of conducting effective oversight and monitoring. In 2020, the Department of Interior expressed significant concerns over what it called, quote, inadequate controls to monitor and hold accountable awardees and their partners in many countries in Africa and Asia. This law would ensure that the United States has such controls. More generally, it would contribute to a fundamental shift in international conservation away from exclusionary fortress conservation towards inclusionary rights-based conservation. As my written testimony explains in more detail, it does so in four main ways. First, it would close the gap in U.S. law by making clear that the Leahy Amendment applies to the Fish and Wildlife Service. Second, it would work proactively by requiring that conservation organizations have effective safeguards in place before they receive or could receive Fish and Wildlife Service funding. Third, it would provide for clear and sensible procedures for reporting and investigating alleged human rights violations. And finally, the law would require annual reports from the Fish and Wildlife Service to Congress, thereby ensuring that this and other committees can play their constitutional role of overseeing the effective implementation of the law. Of course, no one law can end all human rights abuses against these marginalized communities. In that respect, another important way that the U.S. government could support rights-based conservation would be to provide far more financial and technical support directly to indigenous and local conservation organizations, which currently receive only a tiny fraction of total conservation funding. Nevertheless, the Advancing Human Rights-Centered International Conservation Act of 2022 would be a major step forward. It would immediately become a model for other donor governments and international organizations on how to include human rights in international conservation. Thank you again for holding these hearings and for moving forward this critical legislation.
Thank you, Professor Knox. We will now hear from Ms. Caroline Brower, Vice President of Government Affairs of the National Wildlife Refuge Association. Ms. Bauer, welcome to the subcommittee.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, wonderful. Good afternoon, Chair Huffman, Ranking Member Bentz, and esteemed members of the subcommittee. I very much appreciate the invitation to testify today on behalf of the thousands of volunteers and Friends members who provide so many hours of their spare time, their skills, and their hard work to give our nation help our nation's National Wildlife Refuges. My name is Caroline Brower, and I'm the Vice President of Government Affairs for the National Wildlife Refuge Association. At the Refuge Association, we seek to inspire nationwide support for the refuge system, its wildlife, and its habitats. We work with friends groups and volunteers on refuges nationwide. We advocate for increases in operations and maintenance funding, which are, by the way, woefully inadequate. And we work to strengthen the system in all 568 refuges nationwide, a network of 850 million acres of lands and oceans. Before I begin my remarks, I want to acknowledge the loss of a longtime member of this committee and its former chairman, Congressman Don Young. Mr. Young, along with another giant of the House of Representatives, Congressman John Dingell, was a lead sponsor of the National Wildlife Refuge System Improvement Act of 1997. This seminal piece of legislation changed the way the refuge system operated, ensuring that these disparate refuge units would be managed as one system of public lands for the benefit of wildlife habitat and the species that call them home. And more refuge legislation followed. The next year in 1998, the Volunteer and Community Partnership Act passed. Building on the Improvement Act from a year prior, this legislation enabled the refuge system to expand its volunteer programs and to partner with community groups such as Friends organizations. These friends and volunteers increased public awareness of the natural, historical, and cultural resources of their local National Wildlife Refuge and the entire refuge system. And today we have HR 6734, the Keep America's Refuges Operational Act of 2022, which would reauthorize the Volunteer and Community Partnership Act. During its previous reauthorization 4 years ago, this bill passed by a large margin in the House and by voice vote in the Senate. I hope that it receives similar support this year. I particularly want to thank Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, who has sponsored this legislation this year as well as 4 years ago, as well as Congressmen Whitman, Grijalva, Graves, Thompson, and Sablon. These members in particular understand the power of volunteers on our public lands and in our communities outside of refuges as well. For example, in New York City, while there are no National Wildlife Refuges in the city, volunteers and community members with the Yonkers Urban Wildlife Refuge Partnership have worked with refuge system staff since 2014 to create projects like pollinator gardens at schools that have been surrounded by concrete and asphalt for decades. These students' pollinator gardens bring habitat to cities and teach these kids about different habitat types and show them if you create wildlife habitat, birds and butterflies will follow. We are now working to expand this program onto nearby refuges so that kids can visit these wild spaces near their homes. There are also the more traditional friends groups, which are 501c3 nonprofit groups dedicated to sometimes one single refuge, such as the Friends of Malheur National Wildlife Refuge and the Friends of Ankeny National Wildlife Refuge in Oregon. And there's sometimes one complex of several refuges, such as the Friends of San Pablo Bay, which covers 2 Northern California refuges, or in rare cases, many refuges or many acres, such as the Friends of Alaska National Wildlife Refuges, which supports all 16 Alaskan refuges, and the Friends of the Hawaiian Islands, which cover land refuges and one of the 4 Pacific Marine National Monuments. These Friends members and volunteers on refuges who are not part of these Friends organizations total around 38,000 per year pre-COVID. In non-pandemic times, these refuges are open for volunteers. When these refuges are open for volunteers, they contribute between 1 and 1.5 million volunteer hours per year. And this is on everything from pulling invasive weeds to teaching environmental education classes to school kids, leading tours, staffing bookshops, and banding birds and raising fish at fish hatcheries. At a time when the refuge system is severely underfunded, with fewer than 2,800 employees to manage 850 million acres, volunteers are particularly critical. Their efforts combined contribute the equivalent of an additional 700 FTEs, full-time equivalents, to the system, which is over 20% of the workforce. I do want to emphasize, however, that volunteers and friends cannot do their work without the trained expert staff members from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Volunteering on National Wildlife Refuges expands all age groups, professions, geography, and time commitments to provide the system with a wealth of knowledge and abilities. We ask this committee to support these volunteers in their efforts, and we strongly support HR 6734 and urge you to pass it from this subcommittee, the full committee, and the full House. We also support HR 6427, which is the Red River National Wildlife Refuge Boundary Modification Act. Louisiana has incredible waterfowl habitat, and I'm sure this parcel will in the future be a wonderful addition to the BioPR unit on this refuge. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to working with the committee to ensure these two bills are passed into law.
Thank you, Ms. Brower. We will now hear from Ms. Joan Patterson, President of the Coalition of Refuge Friends and Advocates. Ms. Patterson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Huffman, Ranking Member Bentz, and the members of the subcommittee. This testimony is being given on behalf of the Board of Directors of the Coalition of Refuge Friends and Advocates, otherwise known as CORFA. We are a not-for-profit organization incorporated in the Commonwealth of Virginia. We are an all-volunteer board, and we draw our membership from the various Friends members throughout the country. I happen to be the president of the group. CORFA believes that Friends groups, which support refuges, are invaluable community partners to Fish and Wildlife Service. Friends have a critical role in ensuring that communities see a refuge as an asset. Our goal is to build a national network of support for Friends organizations, Friends helping Friends, and sharing their vast knowledge, expertise, and skills so that all of us can better support national wildlife refuges. I thank you for this opportunity to testify in support of Keep America's Refuges Operational Act of 2022. This act allows the National Wildlife Refuge System to work with volunteers in the management of refuges, to facilitate partnerships between U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Friends organizations, and other non-federal entities to educate and engage the public in the conservation of resources associated with refuges, and to encourage donations and other contributions to the system. Volunteers, including members of Friends organization, donate their time, skills, and money to support the mission of a refuge or a complex. For me and others, this experience is life-changing. Years ago, I got involved with the newly formed Friends of the Tualatin River National Wildlife Refuge in order to keep busy while my husband and I were anxiously awaiting word from an adoption agency. At that time, the Tualatin River National Wildlife Refuge near Sherwood, Oregon, consisted of only 12 acres and was not open to the public. The general public wouldn't have access to that refuge for well over a decade. But during that time period, the Friends and local officials advocated for acquisition funds to purchase land from willing sellers. Also during that time, the Friends and staff worked together to create volunteer opportunities for folks to get out onto the refuge. Those folks removed miles of barbed wires, tons of debris, and acres of Himalayan blackberries. We also recruited church and civic groups, scouts, and other community partners to plant thousands of shrubs and trees. The Friends began hosting an annual festival and continue to host it, and that brings in hundreds of people from the Portland metropolitan area. And when we could, we got kids out to the refuge. We saw how thrilled they were to see bald eagles, their curiosity as they tried to figure out whose poop they almost stepped in, and their joy at jumping in puddles. So the Friends organization took on a different task. We started advocating for federal transportation dollars to provide the infrastructure necessary to open the refuge, including safe access. It took some time, but eventually those funds were appropriated and the refuge was opened. That refuge became a part of every volunteer and the surrounding communities. Now more than 150,000 people visit the Tualatin River National Wildlife Refuge annually, and the Friends continue to play an essential role in the education, restoration, and maintenance activities. As mentioned earlier, Friends, community partners, and volunteers are absolutely essential for the service to provide services for the visitors, educational opportunities, recreational opportunities, and to maintain that habitat. During COVID, visitation to the refuges jumped to almost 65 million people. Unfortunately, the volunteers declined during that time period, But as mentioned earlier, pre-COVID, about 38,000 people volunteered yearly, and they donated 1 million hours. They're contributing over 20% of all the work being done on refuges. So I urge you to move forward with this act, and thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, Ms. Patterson. We will now hear from Mr. Ed Penny, Director of Public Policy for the Southern Region of Ducks Unlimited. Welcome, Mr. Penny.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, members of the subcommittee. My name is Ed Penny, and I'm the Director of Public Policy for Ducks Unlimited in the Southern Region. That does cover New Mexico to Virginia. I'm also a waterfowl and wetland ecologist. I appreciate the opportunity to testify on behalf of DU and thank the Chairman and Ranking Member for the invitation to be here today regarding the Red River National Wildlife Refuge Boundary Modification Act. This bill seeks to modify the existing boundary of the refuge to include a property owned by Ducks Unlimited. With more than 1 million members and supporters in the U.S., many of whom are sportsmen and women, DU represents a significant conservation voice for wetlands, waterfowl, and the associated landscapes that support them. DU has been North America's leader in wetland conservation for more than 85 years. Our mission is to conserve, restore, and manage wetlands and associated habitats for North American waterfowl, wetlands, and people. We work in Canada, Mexico, and every state in the United States. Since 1937, DU has conserved more than 15 million acres of habitat important to waterfowl, other wildlife, and people. Many of you are familiar with this work across the continent, and we appreciate your continued bipartisan support for all the federal programs and lands important to migratory birds and their habitat. Our members and volunteers give their time and resources to support wetlands and waterfowl, and we're diligent in doing on-the-ground conservation projects by leveraging public and private dollars to support habitat and outdoor recreation opportunities for all Americans. We support this bill because it supports science-based conservation. Specifically, it will support the goals and objectives of the Lower Mississippi Valley Joint Venture, which is the implementation arm of the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. The Lower Mississippi Valley Joint Venture is a public and private partnership that drives science-based conservation of migratory birds in the region. And to be specific, the JV sets habitat goals for waterfowl by calculating the food value of cropland habitat, forested wetlands, and other wetlands. National Wildlife Refuges and other public lands are a major contributor to these goals, and unfortunately, the Red River National Wildlife Refuge is well below these goals. And therefore, the Fish and Wildlife Service is interested in a future acquisition of this property because of its high waterfowl values, and specifically the property owned by Ducks Unlimited. If Louisiana is going to continue its well-deserved reputation as a sportsmen's and women's paradise, then we must work hard to secure high-quality wetland habitat for future generations of ducks and waterfowlers. Second of all, this bill aligns with DU's strongly held principle of voluntary conservation. In December 2020, Ducks Unlimited acquired a 3,300-acre property in Red River and Caddo parishes, Louisiana, through a willing seller transaction with a local family. This property was actively managed by the landowners for many years to provide waterfowl habitat through farming, through active forest management, and also provide outdoor recreation opportunities. The landowners are conservationists and wish to see this property benefit the public. It facilitates a private-public partnership for conservation by leveraging their private dollars, DU's dollars, with potentially public resources to conserve this key habitat in the Red River Valley. Thirdly, this bill will also benefit the public by helping the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service secure more habitat for waterfowl and more places for public recreation. According to the National Waterfowl Hunters Survey, conducted by the Fish and Wildlife Service and state fish and wildlife agencies, over 25% of hunters point to the lack of places to hunt as a severe problem. This bill will help address this issue by expanding public access by as much as 3,300 acres of public hunting land. Consequently, more public hunting land resulting in more outdoor recreation would provide economic benefits to these local communities by affording the public more opportunities to come and enjoy Louisiana's bountiful natural resources. Fourthly, this bill will benefit the public by not just securing habitat for public recreation, but also provide natural infrastructure benefits like improved air and water quality and flood attenuation. In fact, a single acre of wetland can store as much as 1.5 million gallons of floodwaters. These wetlands not only help purify surface water, but also replenish underlying aquifers. Wetlands also work like giant sponges, trapping runoff water in basins and decrease the speed and volume of water flowing downstream. So once again, I deeply appreciate the opportunity to provide our perspective on this important legislation. We look forward to working with the committee and our partners like the Fish and Wildlife Service as this bill moves forward, and we will continue to support the wildlife and the millions of people who enjoy the outdoors. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for the opportunity to speak in favor of this bill, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Penny. Appreciate that. I want to thank everyone on the panel for your testimony. We'll now bring it back to the members for questions, and I will begin by recognizing myself for the first 5 minutes. Starting with Professor Knox, let me associate myself with the kind remarks that Ranking Member Westerman made. Your engagement on this and your testimony before this subcommittee has just been tremendously helpful to the work that we have put into it. So we appreciate that. And some time has passed since we started this conversation. I think it's been a year and a half since there was an independent panel report that was released. It's been many months since the subcommittee hearing we held on this subject. Wonder if you could tell us what you have seen by way of actual changes at WWF. Any actionable or adequate progress, actionable policies that you feel have been responsive to some of these revelations?
So first, thank you, Chairman Huffman. On the one hand, of course, WWF has made they have announced some policies that they say that they're implementing in response to the panel report and in response to other investigations, including of this subcommittee. I should, of course, clarify that I'm speaking only on my own personal initiative and not in any way on behalf of anyone else, including the panel. In my own view, however, their steps are inadequate. I've made that clear to them directly, and I testified to some degree of that effect to this committee in October. Let me give you a couple of examples of what I mean. So at her testimony in October, the vice president of WWF said one of the examples she gave for why WWF was doing a better job was that she pointed to their efforts to successfully, in her words, provide access to a particular national park in Cameroon, Lobeki National Park, to the Baka. And as I explained in my written testimony, that's just not the case. The Baka still don't have access to this park. A detailed report by the Forest Peoples Program that came out just last month that was based on on-the-ground reporting concluded their principal conclusion was that the Baka still don't have any more access to the park than they've had in the past. And again, this is access that they were promised to have 20 years ago when the parks were created. So WWF was involved in the creation of the parks. WWF was involved in these talks with the Baka. They've been involved all along. There's no excuse for them not to know the facts on the ground. They don't have total control, of course, over what happens in Cameroon, but they do have total control over how they represent their own behavior, including to this subcommittee and to the public. A second example, which I also give in my written remarks in more detail, is one that I just found out about recently. A graduate student working in the Republic of Congo as part of an effort supported supposedly by WWF to try and help the Baka map their own uses of the forest and report on abuses more directly through the use of handheld devices, essentially. It's a very clever idea. He informed me that just last month, WWF in the Republic of Congo refused to let him go interview the Baka. This was despite the fact that that was the whole point of his being there. And the reason they gave for him was that they essentially, they accused him of being a spy. He got the impression they were worried about what the Baka would tell him. He and his project supervisor, and again, this is a major research program at the University College of London, raised this with higher levels of WWF. He stayed in Simbe for 2 weeks waiting for approval to go and was never granted it. And as he said, this is both discriminatory toward the Baka because they're cutting off access to them. It's also discriminatory toward the scientists, the anthropologists and others who are working with them and trying to report. So that, to me, is highly troubling. And it, in my mind, casts doubt on whether WWF has really changed its approach to reporting honestly and transparently about not only what they're doing, but the failures in what they're doing, the obstacles they're not able to overcome, including their own shortcomings.
Yeah, appreciate that. I know one of the concerns I had, we talked about at the hearing, was that WWF seemed more interested in image protection and PR than actual reform on the ground. I mean, changing logos on trucks to protect the brand, but I remember testimony that not a single senior personnel, WWF personnel, had been let go as a result of these atrocities. Is there anything new on that front?
Not that I'm aware of, sir, no. And I will say that I'm in touch with a lot of people in different conservation organizations at all levels of the organizations, including WWF, at lower levels as well. And as I think I said in the testimony in October, there is a feeling, including at lower levels of a number of these organizations, that they have to change their attitude, they have to change their approach. It's the senior leadership, I think, that is more resistant, frankly, to making the changes that are necessary.
Yeah, appreciate that. Thanks very much. I yield back. Ranking Member Benz, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Knox, let's continue with questions to you. Do you think we're overly optimistic in including in the bill this social safeguard plan? And I'm looking specifically, there's a lot of parts of it here, but the part I'm looking at are found on page 9. It says measures to improve governance, increase the agency, protect the rights. Okay, so all good ideas, but do you think, is this going to happen? And and I'm not really, I don't want to argue against I co-sponsor this bill, but my question is, do you have a better idea?
I'm sorry, Ranking Member Bentz, I may have missed the specific language you were pointing to in the bill.
Okay, so on page 8, it says that it defines what a social safeguard plan is, sir. And you have to have one if you're one of the groups receiving money. And then if you go to the next page, the plan will include measures to improve governance, increase the agency, protect the rights and needs of indigenous peoples. Okay, great. That sounds good. What are the odds of it happening, and should we be doing something other than this to affect what we're trying to do, which is to make sure the money gets spent right without creating harm to people?
Right. No, thank you for that question, Ranking Member Bentz. I think you put your finger on something really important. I guess I'll have 2 points in my response to that. One is, I do think this is the right kind of language to include. There are a number of studies now that show that really the most efficient and effective, as well as the fairest and most equitable way to pursue conservation is in partnership with the local communities and indigenous peoples. I think that's kind of commonsensical, although it was not the prevailing attitude for a long time. So measures to improve their governance, increase their agency, and protect their rights in many ways are crucial to effective conservation, as well as crucial to trying to avoid the kinds of horrific human rights abuses that we've seen. But the second point I'll make, which I think is kind of going to your question more, is it's going to be hard to measure and achieve that. A lot of the language in this bill is really going to be up to Fish and Wildlife Service to implement in ways that make logical sense. And I just want to stress, I guess, the importance of Fish and Wildlife being committed to achieving the goals of this bill in the ways that they can. There's some language in here, I think unavoidable language, that leaves it up to Fish and Wildlife to have some discretion based on the kinds of projects that are involved. I would hate to see that language used as a way of trying to kind of, as I think one of you or one of your colleagues asked, to kind of as an excuse for not doing more, because really in these conditions, under these circumstances, what more can you do? I think there's a lot that can be done to improve the governance and protect the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, even in these extremely difficult situations. Will it be a simple thing to do? Will it always be successful? No, not necessarily. But I think that the requirement has to be to do what can be done and to require conservation organizations to do what can be done and not simply settle because, what can we do? It's a difficult situation, so we need not do anything.
Right, and I think what you're referring to is my question to Mr. Girton, which was taken out of his testimony, and he had put in this sentence after talking about all of the things that they were going to do. Then he put in the sentence which reads, however, there is also an inherent risk in working in these regions that can impact the service's work, including human rights abuse, description, or abuse of power. And what he was basically doing is establishing the foundation for failure, if you ask me, but he assured me otherwise. But wasn't he just merely calling out how difficult it was going to be to achieve the those things we put in this bill? And my question to you, of course, in the minute we have left is, should we be doing something that's more direct and less wishful thinking?
Well, Ranking Member Bentz, I think this is where the annual reporting to the committees by Fish and Wildlife Service is so important. I think this is where the committees, in my opinion, need to stay in a dialogue with this administration and future administrations with the Fish and Wildlife Service on the implementation of this bill, and not simply have Fish and Wildlife treat this as if this is the Congress's last word, and that after this they're on their own. I think that there has to be this continuing kind of dialogue to see what works best, to see what might be improved further, to see where there might be continuing gaps, and to make the adjustments that are appropriate. But in my opinion, as I said in my testimony, I think this is a terrific start. I think this does give them the framework and the right tools to use, but I think the committee is going to need to stay involved in making sure that they're used in the right way.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for your thoughtful approach, and with that, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman, and I believe Mr. Lowenthal is next. Mr. Lowenthal, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to go to Ms. Brower. Talk a little bit more about the Keep America's Refuges Operational Act. Ms. Brower, the National Wildlife Refuges, they provide numerous benefits, individual, societal benefits, as you've already pointed out, fish and wildlife conservation, open space, science, education, water quality, flood resilience. Millions of recreational users are drawn to the refuge system's thriving fish and animal populations. I would like you to kind of describe a little bit about the partnerships the communities have, how you see the local and surrounding communities benefiting by being nearby wildlife refuges. Are there any downsides also? And just what role do these communities that surround the refuges benefit, and what input do they have into the refuges?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, sir, for that question. That's a really good question. In my opinion, there's no downside to having these wildlife refuges in your communities. And these communities benefit from them. There are economic benefits. I had spoken in my testimony about the Improvement Act, which established, the big 6 compatible uses on refuges. Hunters come to these areas to go hunting. We have fishermen, there's wildlife watchers. So everybody in the community benefits from people and visitors coming to these areas from outside the community. Folks inside the community who live near these refuges really truly benefit. These outdoor areas, I think we've really seen this during COVID, that these refuges give people a place to go and to recreate, to go hunting, to go fishing, to go just be in nature. So there are numerous benefits that come for everybody in these communities. Absolutely.
I wonder, are there some people in the community who resent the refuges in the sense that they lose control over development issues? Or do you ever have to deal with issues such as that?
We have occasionally. So I'm sure most of the folks on in this hearing room are familiar with PILT and with the Refuge Fund. These programs are meant to sort of compensate the local communities for the loss of the tax base when these lands are owned by the federal government. So I think it's really important for those programs to be funded as well. PILT is in general funded a little bit better than the Refuge Fund. It gets complicated on which refuges receive funding from which of those programs. So there is that. There is another school of thought that says that the refuges bring enough economic development into the community that you don't necessarily need this federal funding going to them. But I think it does help. I think that once a refuge is established, I've been working on refuges from the advocacy side, from the nonprofit side for 14 years now. And I have never heard anybody tell me that they regretted having a refuge in their area. I've never heard that.
Thank you. I want to ask then Ms. Patterson. You made a strong, argument in terms of the partnerships with volunteers and youth groups, landowners, neighbors, residents of local communities, and how volunteers help to keep these refuges operational, how many millions of tourists that visit each year. The question I have is, how adequate is the funding that Congress provides to promote these voluntary programs? Does it do what you would like to see, and is it adequate? Ms. Patterson.
Congressman, thank you for that question. And I'd have to say, at this particular point in time, no, the funding is not adequate. The problems that some of volunteers face is sometimes they can't give of their time because there is not someone who's part of Fish and Wildlife Service staff to oversee that volunteer work. So now there are times where, people can't get out onto a refuge to do volunteer work. The other problem some friends groups talk to me about are that, hey, they may have received a grant to do work on a refuge, but permits are required. And there's not enough staffing, Fish and Wildlife Service staff, to do the work required for those permits. So there are times that the friends are raising money for a particular project, but that money is in jeopardy because things can't be done in a timely manner. And there is such a shortage of staffing, Fish and Wildlife Service staff on refuges, that this is an ongoing problem. And so funding does need to be increased for the refuge system.
Thank you, Ms. Patterson. And Mr. Lowenthal's time has expired. We'll now recognize Mr. Soto for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have the honor of representing the fastest growing district in the Congress. We grew 40% over the last 10 years. When you go to Central Florida, you'll see the signs of growth everywhere. That's good for businesses. It's helping us address an affordable housing issue, but it also puts huge pressure on our ecosystems. When you drive down the 528 from Orlando out to Cape Canaveral, you'll see development for many miles until you kind of get to a place where it just starts fading away. And it converts to woods and to swamps and rivers, and that has something to do with the growth boundary we have on the Conlatchachi and also with the National Wildlife Refuges we have in Brevard, just over the county line, in the areas around the St. John's. We, of course, have the St. John's National Wildlife Refuge, 19 federal and state-listed species, birds, mammals, like muskrats and rabbits, and certainly a place for people to go hiking, fishing, and doing a lot of wonderful recreational activities. Boating is huge in Florida. Then Merritt Island, a bird sanctuary right near NASA. It's kind of an amazing thing to behold as we have the busiest spaceport in the world. 70% of all space flight goes through Cape Canaveral, yet there's a bird sanctuary right there that would be impress anyone from any state in the union. Sea turtles, birds, gopher tortoises, fish. So this is something we want to continue to protect. And so I appreciate you all being here today. I wanted to give you, Chairman, my additional time to ask. I think you had some additional questions you wanted to ask.
I did, and I thank
defer
the
to you.
gentleman. Appreciate that very much.
Yield.
And by the way, if anybody's wondering why we have a lot of weird sounds in the hearing room today, there's either some kind of construction out this window over here, or the Russians have deployed an acoustic weapon of some kind against the committee. But it's been a little distracting here for the last 10 minutes, so I apologize. Professor Knox, you've talked a little bit about what the federal government should be doing to have better standards in place and to exercise better oversight. Do you believe H.R. 7025 aligns with the right standards?
Yes, I very much do. I think that the idea of building on the Leahy Amendment by both putting in place or requiring that Fish and Wildlife Service put in place protections proactively and providing for sensible procedures to investigate and report on allegations afterward. I think that's exactly the right approach to take. I think one of the things that really came clear in the hearing in October was the link between denying Indigenous rights kind of at the root of the problem, that is denying their ability to even have access to their ancestral territory, the link between that and the kinds of terrible specific violations that became the subject of so much of the reporting, the murder, the rape, the tortures, that those things are inextricably linked. If you deny people access to their homes and they try and get back into their homes, and you have, again, poorly trained and paid, eco guards trying to enforce rules that say you can't come back in at all, you're going to have conflicts, and that's going to be a fertile ground then for abuses. So I think this bill, I'm a law professor, and as you said, a former special rapporteur. I'm used to criticizing governments all the time, so it's a little bit uncomfortable for me to be telling you this bill is great, and I really don't have much more to say about it, but I do think it's great. I'm very happy with it. I hope it's enacted. You'll accept that.
Once in a while, we appreciate
I'm sure it
that.
could be improved in some ways, anything can, but I think if this were enacted tomorrow, that would be, as I've said before, this would immediately become a model that other countries and the international organizations that provide funding for conservation would look to.
And as I understand it, Leahy vetting simply applies to prohibiting support for security units that commit human rights abuses. This bill actually goes further than that and has broader standards and tools. Take it you believe that too is appropriate?
Yes, of course, absolutely. I mean, Leahy is critical, but I think what we've seen with Leahy is that it leaves so much to be filled in. The whole concept of Leahy vetting is something that the State Department and DOD have tried to kind of build up over time, because the Leahy amendments themselves don't really say exactly how the vetting is supposed to work. And so I think what this bill does in a way that's specifically appropriate to international conservation is provide a kind of framework around that central Leahy prohibition that, again, is designed to get at the underlying problems, but also not just give Fish and Wildlife Service tools, but tell them how to use the tools, how the tools make sense to be used.
Thank you very much. I want to thank this panel. Your testimony has been very, very helpful. We appreciate it. The members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to those in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members must submit written questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the record will be kept open for 10 business days to allow for responses. If there is no further business before the subcommittee, and seeing none, then without objection, we stand adjourned. Thank you.